You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast. Hey, glad to have you on board. Hope you're doing well. I am still sort of in the thick of traveling, although some of my bigger trips are certainly over with, which I'm grateful for. Got ill, got some of that virus that was going around the country, and that's one of the challenges when you're traveling. Not pleasant at all. Nevertheless, I'm glad I'm kind of through that almost. So hope you don't catch it, whatever the case may be. We are in the midst of a snowstorm here in the middle of Montana, so we need the moisture, but it's definitely has kind of shut things down here for a little while. If you're wondering what we're all about, well, we're all about research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. So we try to get into the nitty-gritty details and topics that most podcasts are not going to be able to delve into. So, because we believe that if you're just doing what everyone else is doing, how are you going to have a competitive advantage? So, all right. Well, I just want to let you know about my website, of course. We have products here that you can certainly purchase. I'm just opening up the store again. So you can look at some of the things that we have for sale and also the services that we provide. Well, this week I am getting into the topic of bromethalin. And so the reason for this is I have talked on bromethalin in the past, but I got a request from clearly a listener who wanted me to sort of wonder if there was any updated information on bromethalin's LD50. I can't say that I have necessarily updated information, but I may have information on bromethalin that's not necessarily maybe well known out in the pest control or wildlife control community. So I'm going to be probably doing a couple of presentations on bromethalin. I have a few more articles that I'm going to need to summarize and include, so I'm just going to break it up into a couple of different podcasts on bromethalin. So we're going to just kind of do a little bit of a deep dive on bromethalin because this is an active ingredient that is being used more now because of greater restrictions on second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides. So, and that may be the case, and sometimes people think that it's safer, and we have to be very careful of this term, safer, when we're dealing with pesticides. It's not necessarily false. I'm just saying that sometimes it can breed a little bit more maybe cavalierness. It's a very strange thing because remember there's the human component. Is driving safe compared to flying, right? How do you do some of these comparisons? And it's one of the biggest challenges that I have in talking about vertebrate pest management, particularly in the area of pesticides. So anyways, let's kind of get on with it without spending a lot more time. A little bit of history on bromethalin, of course. It was basically investigated, or they were investigating some chemicals, Eli Lilly that is, and that company is still around. Kind of in the mid-50s, they were looking for stuff from fungicides as something that could be possibly used in a rodenticide, right? It takes a lot of money, a lot of time, to find a new rodenticide, right? And so clearly they were looking into this, and they were specifically looking at a group of chemical called diphenylamines, okay? So kind of a big word there to be sure. And what they ultimately discovered was a product called bromethalin, right? And so that was discovered in 1979. So historically speaking, it's a relatively new toxicant for rodents, right? It's a relatively new one, right? Especially when you compare it to something like strychnine that's been around for hundreds of years, right? So it's definitely been a latecomer to the party, so to speak. And in the United States, it was officially registered by the EPA in 1984. So, not a long time ago, right? It's hard to imagine in my lifetime this product was basically brought to market. Well, for those of you that have some chemistry background, you can kind of see the chemical formula there, the structure of it, right? And the product has yellowish crystals, and by this we mean this is the technical, right? Technical is a term used for the pure active ingredient, right? Not the formulation. Formulation refers to the materials used with an active ingredient to make it attractive to a rodent, right? So you have the active ingredient and the formulation, and combined they form the bait, right? So you need something that's going to be an attractant, and of course you need the actual poison. That's the active ingredient. So bromethalin is insoluble in water, right? So that's sort of interesting, but it is fat soluble, right? So it is something that can go through, that can be absorbed into fat. So how does it work? Well, it's a little complicated, but nevertheless, so the organism eats it. I'm not suggesting that people eat this, right? But just a little icon there for you. So something is ingested, then it passes around, gets absorbed through the stomach, of course, starts getting to the bloodstream, heads into the liver where it is metabolized, right? So it begins this process of where the body begins to break it down. The active metabolite is dimethylbromethylin. That particular chemical begins to interfere with the mitochondria. And so the mitochondria creates ATP, which is an energy source. So when we have food in our body, it ultimately develops into ATP, which is the energy used by our cells. That is interrupted by this desmethylbromethylin. Okay, so I'm trying to get these pronunciations out there. And it disrupts this, and then it disrupts these osmotic pumps in the control mechanism, so it begins to attack us at a metabolic level and a neurological level, right? So it's a serious product, to be sure, right? So it's something that, and this is how it kills the rodents that consume it. One of the ways to certainly think about it is that it has a nervous mode of action. In other words, it attacks the connections in terms of the nervous system. Okay. And now, what's the human health risk? Well, it's pretty high, right? So orally, remember, there's different ways we can poison ourselves or we can poison something. So you have oral exposure, inhalation exposure, dermal exposure. Dermal exposure is something we don't talk a lot about, because you have to work at it to get, in terms of our vertebrate pest world, if you're being poisoned dermally, that's through your skin, something really went wrong, right? So you were violating all kinds of PPE and proper practices, right? So, orally it's easier to make a mistake in that regard, right? But when it comes to dermal, but nevertheless, these are the three primary ways that we can be poisoned by something, right? Orally, we eat it, we breathe it, or it's absorbed through our skin, right? So it is a non-anticoagulant, right? So it doesn't affect the blood clotting of an organism. And so in this sense, it's in the non-anticoagulant category, of which there is zinc phosphide, that's the active ingredient. Of course, strychnine is another active ingredient in the non-anticoagulant world. So bromethalin is a non-anticoagulant, just like cocalciferol, right? So I have done some podcasts on cocalciferol, that's vitamin D, right? So nevertheless, but it's slower acting. Strychnine usually can kill. You'll see some activity sometimes as quick as 10 to 15 minutes. Zinc phosphide, the organism's typically dead within 24 hours, right? Sometimes as quickly as 12. But with bromethalin, it's slower than that, okay? So, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it can reduce the risk of where the animal gets wise to it, right? Now, when we're looking at acute toxicity levels, we just want to remind ourselves, what exactly does that mean? So with the oral acute, these are standards developed by, I believe the EPA establishes these acute toxicity levels, if memory serves. But anyways, here's the chart, right? So it's acute toxicity is anything that is up to and including 50 milligrams per kilogram on the LD50 on the oral. That is not a whole lot, right? Remember, a milligram is a millionth of a kilogram. Now, a kilogram is 2.2 pounds. Divide that by a million times, million parts. So up to 50 of those per kilogram is enough to get into the acute toxicity level, right? So so if someone's weighing 220 pounds, that would be 100. So 5,000 milligrams would be enough to kill me, theoretically, if I happen to eat bromethalin. Now you say, well, 5,000 milligrams, that's a lot. No, it isn't. Okay, so it doesn't take 5,000 milligrams. This is not a whole lot. Okay, now when it comes to the dermal exposure, it's only a category 2. Category 2 is anywhere from 200 milligrams to 2,000 milligrams per kilogram, right? So these are LD50 ratios. And then, of course, inhalation, this is where it's up to 0.2 milligrams per liter. And bromethalin can kill up to that particular level. So it's in this particular category. So this is something that is not to be toyed with, to be sure. So if your idea is that this is quote unquote safe, it is not safe. It doesn't mean we shouldn't use it. It just means that this is not something to be playing around with. This is a serious rodenticide, to be sure. So here's some other values if you're looking for some data on bromethalin. And so remember, whenever researchers are testing things, we're not testing things on people, of course, right? So they have to test it on animals, find out what this means. And so for those of you that are driving, for the oral, these are going to be primarily oral, although there's a few other examples here. So oral exposure to a rat, that would be pretty much a normally rat or a lab rat, right? The LD50 for males is 10.7 milligrams per kilogram. Interestingly, for females, the oral toxicity is 9.1. So it's actually more toxic to females than it would be to males, which is unusual because most rodenticides, females are harder to kill. Now, in terms of the dermal studies for a rabbit, it took the LD50 for dermal exposure was 2,000 milligrams per kilogram. So that made it the category 2, which we've already discussed. Now, in terms of a rat study for the inhalation test, the LC50, that's the lethal concentration 50%, was 0.024 milligrams per liter. So not a whole lot to inhale. That made it a category 1. Now, in terms of eye irritation, there was only slight. So that means you don't have to necessarily worry a whole lot about getting it into your eyes. Now, I'm not telling you to get it into your eyes, but if you're working with the bait and all of a sudden it gets up into your eyes, you're probably not going to get a whole lot of irritation with that. That actually was only a toxicity category of 3. And then in skin irritation on the rabbit test as well, it was only a category 4. So not really irritating at all to the skin, which is good news, right? We don't want that. Now, in terms of dermal sensitization, let me get that word out. It was a non-sensitizer. In other words, the idea being is if they put it on the skin, does it make the skin, when you treat it again, more vulnerable to it? And the answer is no, it doesn't, which is also a good thing. Now, there has been some research done on what's called the no observable effect level. It's called NOEL is the acronym. NOEL, just like Christmas time, right? Noel, right? In terms of the Christmas carol. NOEL is no observable effect level. In other words, how much can an animal eat and not show any signs of poisoning? Well, for dogs, that answer is 25 micrograms per kilogram. So anything from 0 to 25 micrograms is the no observable effect level. Same way with rats, 25 micrograms. Now, just to give you an idea of just how small of an amount that is, a microgram is 1 billionth, that's with a B, of a kilogram. So we've talked about a milligram as a millionth of a kilogram. We take 2.2 pounds, divide it into a million parts. That's a milligram. A microgram is 1/billionth of a kilogram. So 25 of those per kilogram. So if you had a 2.2 pound dog, up to 25 of those, and the dog was exposed, chances are there'd be no effect on your dog. Okay, so that is another term that you may not have been familiar with when it comes to understanding rodenticides. In other words, how much can an animal consume before it begins to show signs of poisoning? Well, at least as far as dogs and rats are concerned, the no observable effect level was 25 micrograms per kilogram. Okay. All right, let's take a look at some LD50s as well with some other research. Now, you'll notice that there is conflicting information, and so this can be challenging when we're dealing with rodenticides, right? Because we want that certainty. We want to feel that we know and we have command over this particular product. Unfortunately, it's not that simple, right? So one researcher may follow pure laboratory protocols and come up with a different answer of an LD50 than another researcher. It's not that they've done something wrong. It's that animals aren't machines. So a different batch of rats may have a different response, and likely will have a different response, than another batch of rats. Well, he says, well, I thought we knew what the LD50 is. Yes, we do, but it's not necessarily a precise number, right? So it's better to think of LD50 as a range of numbers, a range of where half the population will die, because different populations are going to die at different LD50s if you're looking at it as a singular number. Now, why is this important for you to understand? And that is, you may think that, someone has a 50-pound dog and you're calculating the LD50 and says, oh, right, well, maybe. And I'm just throwing some numbers out here, okay? That this is not based on anything. I'm just trying to give an illustration. And let's say you're using XYZ rodenticide, and the LD50 is, let's just say it's 1 ounce per kilogram, right? So 1 ounce of bait per kilogram of animal. All right, so that the dog you're dealing with is 22 pounds. And so that means that dog would have to eat 10 ounces of bait in order to hit the LD50. And you're thinking, all right, well, I'm only using 4 ounces of bait on this property, so there's no way this animal can consume enough to poison itself. Don't be so sure, because what if I told you the dog had cancer, or what if the dog had diabetes? There are people who treat their dogs this way, right? They're giving them shots all the time. They're giving them special medications, special diets, and this is something that some animal owners will do. And you may think things are safer, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, maybe you didn't close that bait station carefully enough and didn't lock. And all of a sudden, the dog gets in there and starts eating your bait, and the dog dies. And you're like, how can it be possible that it's my fault? It was only 4 ounces of bait in there. How can the dog be dead? Well, because you didn't compensate for the fact that the dog was sick. And so maybe the LD50 for that dog was significantly lower. Plus, you don't know that maybe the dog went over to the neighbor's house and ate a rat or two that was poisoned with bromethalin, and so it already had a pre-dose. See how complicated this can be? All right, I'm not trying to make your life really miserable here. I just want us to be aware of the complexity of what we're dealing with. So let's go down through the LD50. So for rats, the LD50 for females is 9.1, and for males, 10.7. For mice, the LD50 for bromethalin for females is 8.1 milligrams per kilogram, and for males, it's 5.3 milligrams per kilogram. So notice how with mice it flipped. But notice how hard it is to kill female mice. It takes almost as much milligrams per kilogram to kill a mouse as it does a rat, which is rather interesting. Mice typically are hard to kill when it comes to rodenticides. Now, how sensitive is a cat? Well, the LD50 for a cat, that's a house cat referring to, is 1.8 milligrams per kilogram. Cats are very sensitive to bromethalin poisoning. And this is something that you're going to have to think about, because what is a cat going to do when a cat sees a sick mouse that may have been poisoned with bromethalin? What's the risk of secondary poisoning with that cat? Especially given how sensitive cats are to the bromethalin poisoning. Dogs are 4.7 milligrams per kilogram. Rabbits, 3.0 milligrams per kilogram. Guinea pigs, the researchers said they're almost immune to it. But it was less than 1,000 milligrams per kilogram, but it took a lot, right? So it took a lot. Something would really have to go wrong for the guinea pig to die from bromethalin. But notice how another researcher found his LD50 was 2.0 milligrams per kilogram for a rat. Didn't distinguish between male or female on that. And then for mouse, the LD50 was 5.3. So you can see different researchers come up with different results. All right, so definitely keep that in mind. So as I said earlier, cats are highly sensitive to bromethalin, only a 1.8 milligram per kilogram on a house cat. But here's something else you need to consider, and that is, what is the minimum lethal dose? That is, in terms of the research, how low can you go and still obtain mortality? And the researchers said 0.24 milligrams per kilogram. That is, less than what? Almost 7 times lower than the LD50 for a cat. So you could have cat mortality occurring at 0.24 milligrams per kilogram dose. Now, how many ounces of bait would that be? Because a lot of you, I'm sure, are not thinking milligrams per kilogram when you're working with your bait. How many ounces of bait would that cat need to consume to reach the minimum lethal dose? And your answer is slightly more than 1/3 of an ounce. Now, chances are a cat is not going to be eating your bait directly, although with some of our fat-based baits, that may happen, right? But nevertheless, how many mice would that be for that cat? So the LD50 for a 10-pound cat would be 2.88 ounces, almost 3 ounces of bait, but the minimum lethal dose level is just slightly more than 1/3 of an ounce. Do you see how complex this becomes? So when you're looking at a rodenticide, don't just simply rely on the LD50. The LD50 doesn't tell you everything that you need to know about the action of that particular active ingredient. So here's something else to think about, and that is, how does the rodenticide act on the cat or the organism? Well, this is dose dependent. So bromethalin brings forth 2 different syndromes depending on the level of dose. So if the organism consumes more than the LD50, then the signs occur in that animal within 24 hours, and the signs are, it's called convulsant syndrome. The animal will be getting muscle tremors. It'll get hot, hyperthermia rather than hypothermia. It'll become very excited and will start developing seizures. If the animal is being exposed to something less than the LD50, it goes into what's known as toxic syndrome. So convulsant syndrome is when the animal gets a lot in a short period of time, and it starts getting excited in terms of tremors. Toxic syndrome is slower because the animal didn't get as much of a dose, and signs typically occur within 1 to 5 days. And the signs are, its hind legs start going wobbly and weak, and it starts becoming depressed, called central nervous system depression. The animal's just not acting right. Well, it's not acting right because it doesn't feel good, right? And it's losing the ability to use its hind legs. That can occur with dogs, and it can occur with cats. But cats, of course, are highly sensitive to bromethalin. Now, the sublethal effects, right? Not all animals die when they're exposed to bromethalin, right? Just like not every poisoning works. So when rats are receiving multiple low doses or a sublethal exposure, they too will develop a hind leg weakness that we talked about with cats and dogs. And they will also lose the ability to be able to feel with their hands, with their feet. Those signs will typically occur within 12 to 24 hours. Now, why is this important? If a rat loses its ability to use its hind legs, it makes it more vulnerable to a predator, like a cat. So that means the cat may be more vulnerable to getting secondary poisoning with your anticoagulant. Now, I'm sure at this point you're scared to death, but I don't want you to be totally scared to death. I'm not trying to make you not use bromethalin, right? And I'm just simply saying because every rodenticide has its weaknesses and its problems, right? So nothing is sure. You have to weigh your risks and reward depending on your situation, right? Because there's also risks with having rats and mice around, right? So it's not just simply, I'm not trying to demonize bromethalin. All of our rodenticides have issues because they're toxic, right? We wouldn't use them if they weren't toxic, right? So nevertheless, but we need to have a better understanding and really a good appreciation. The way I like to give an analogy to people is like toxicants are important and they are okay to use just like a gun is. Guns are dangerous. If you're pointing them the wrong way, they can do a lot of bad things. Rodenticides are dangerous and they can do a lot of bad things if you don't use them the right way. My point here is make sure you're using your rodenticides the way the label tells you and with good common sense. And that takes time and that takes experience, but it also means that you're not cavalier with your rodenticides. All right, well, we'll talk more about bromethalin and some other issues down the road here as I do a little bit more reading, but that should be enough to shake you up for the moment. And hopefully it makes you a better pest controller, a better wildlife control operator, because we need you in the field, and these are important tools and we want to use them wisely. I'm Stephen Vantassel. This is the Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Do subscribe to the channel if you would. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Until next time, take care, everyone.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and/or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.